The twins never woke, not when Elena scooped them both up at once, one under each arm like squirming footballs, nor when she sprinted down the stairs, fumbling with the front door lock, nor when she ran screaming into the middle of the quiet suburban street. A passing car stopped, its driver helping her call 911 while she clutched the confused, sleepy children. The responding officers found a 37-year-old man hiding in a forgotten maintenance space between the walls of the house, a narrow passage constructed during Prohibition to hide liquor that had been sealed off decades ago in renovations, but connected multiple rooms through what appeared to be closet walls. The space contained evidence that he had been living there for months: a filthy mattress, containers of water, stolen food, and a crude waste bucket. Most disturbing was his surveillance system. Tiny cameras he had installed in every room of the house, disguised as electrical outlets, alarm sensors, and smoke detectors. Officers found hundreds of hours of recordings on multiple hard drives: the family eating dinner, the parents' intimate moments, the children bathing and sleeping. The man had constructed a precise map of the home's ductwork and plumbing, creating a network he could navigate silently inside the walls. Notebook pages detailed each family member's routine: when they showered, when they ate, when they were alone. One page was dedicated entirely to Elena, featuring observations like always sits with her back to the kitchen vent and jumps when startled, fun to watch. When questioned about his intentions, the man smiled and said only, "They were my family. I protected them while they slept. I was going to introduce myself to the children tonight. They would have liked my games." The Whitakers sold the house at a significant loss and moved across the country. Elena changed her major from psychology to computer security, specializing in detecting surveillance devices. She still checks inside every closet before sitting down in an unfamiliar room, and has developed a habit of covering all vents and outlets in hotel rooms before she can sleep. Carlos Mendez double-checked his advanced dive computer as the morning sun spilled across the cenote's turquoise surface. The limestone sinkhole in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula looked like a postcard, a perfect circular pool surrounded by lush vegetation, sunlight penetrating the crystal waters to illuminate white sand 30 feet below. But Carlos wasn't interested in the tourist-friendly upper waters. His focus lay on a newly discovered passage branching off from the main Dos Ojos underwater cave system, a narrow tunnel spotted by a local guide just weeks earlier that didn't appear on any existing maps. At 42, Carlos had logged over 1,000 cave dives across 4 continents, earning a reputation as one of the most meticulous technical divers in the community. He never took unnecessary risks, which made his decision to dive solo today so out of character. His regular partner Liam had pulled out with an ear infection, and protocol demanded Carlos reschedule. Yet something about this particular passage called to him with an urgency he couldn't explain. Just a preliminary survey, he told himself as he methodically assembled his side mount tanks, redundant regulators, and multiple lights. 1 hour down, no penetration beyond the line of sight rule without backup. Even as he recited the safety mantras, Carlos knew he was lying to himself. The uncharted darkness below had been haunting his dreams for days, filled with whispers of something ancient waiting to be found. Sarah Miller had always been a light sleeper, but since moving into the old Victorian home on Maple Street 6 months ago, her insomnia had become unbearable. The house whispered at night, floorboards that creaked without being stepped on, the rhythmic tapping of branches that didn't quite match the wind outside, and the occasional rustling in the walls that was too deliberate to be mice. Living alone at 32 had always felt liberating until now. Lately, she would wake with her heart racing, sheets damp with sweat, certain someone had just whispered her name. Friends laughed when she mentioned it, blaming her overactive imagination or suggesting she download a sleep-tracking app. Sarah installed 3 new deadbolts instead. The house had seemed perfect when she first toured it: spacious rooms with high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and bay windows that flooded the space with natural light. The real estate agent mentioned its colorful history in passing, but Sarah hadn't pressed for details. The price was well below market value, a rare find in this desirable neighborhood. Only after signing the closing papers did she learn about the previous owner, an elderly widow who had lived alone for 30 years before passing away in her sleep. The neighbors spoke of her fondly, though several mentioned how she'd become eccentric in her final years, constantly calling the police about intruders no one else ever saw. Sarah dismissed these stories until her third week in the house, when she found the kitchen door. She'd been repainting the guest bedroom when her roller bumped against a section of wall that sounded different from the rest. Curious, she tapped along the surface until she located the edges of what appeared to be a small access panel, painted over so many times it had become nearly invisible. It took her almost an hour with a utility knife to cut through the layers of paint. The narrow door opened to reveal a dusty crawlspace between the walls, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. What disturbed her most wasn't the space itself, but the items she found inside: a folded blanket, an ancient flashlight, and a glass jar containing nail clippings and strands of gray hair. Mark Tennyson's eyelids grew heavy as his rental car devoured another mile of the desolate Highway 16, cutting through northern British Columbia. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m., and he hadn't passed another vehicle in over 2 hours. His GPS had surrendered to the wilderness an hour back, the screen displaying nothing but a blue dot suspended in digital emptiness. Mark wasn't concerned. The route was a straight shot for another 200 miles before his turnoff, and he had a full tank of gas. The conference had run late, forcing him to drive through the night rather than wait for morning. Outside his windows, the densely packed pines pressed close to the roadway, swallowing all light except the narrow tunnel carved by his headlights. The radio cycled through static, occasionally catching fragments of a late-night talk show discussing local disappearances before dissolving back into white noise. Mark rolled down the window, letting the biting cold air slap him awake as his high beams caught the reflective eyes of something watching from between the trees. The figure materialized suddenly at the roadside, a woman in a pale dress so thin it seemed impossible in the frigid night air. She stood with her thumb extended, her form illuminated in Mark's headlights for just seconds before he shot past. In his rearview mirror, she became a diminishing pale smudge against the blackness. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Company policy strictly prohibited picking up hitchhikers, but his conscience gnawed at him. Who would be out here, dressed like that, miles from any town? Maybe she was stranded or in trouble. The temperature was dropping fast. The car's display now showed 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Against his better judgment, Mark eased onto the brake, pulling onto the shoulder about 50 yards ahead of where she stood. He left the engine running, high beams cutting through the mist that had begun to rise from the asphalt. Through the rearview mirror, he watched the woman begin her approach, a solitary figure on an empty road that suddenly felt much darker than before. Something was wrong with the way she moved. Each step seemed disconnected from the previous one, a jerky marionette walk that sent a wave of unease through Mark's body. As she entered the red glow of his taillights, he could see her dress was not white, but a dingy gray, soiled with dark stains. Her face remained obscured by long, matted black hair that hung limply past her shoulders. Mark's finger hovered over the door lock button, though he had already secured the car upon stopping. Still, he waited, telling himself he was being ridiculous. She was probably injured or hypothermic, explaining the strange gait. He cracked his window just enough to speak, the sudden rush of cold air carrying a stomach-turning odor, something rotten and earthy. The woman stopped about 10 feet from his bumper and stood motionless, swaying slightly as if moved by a breeze, though the air had gone completely still. "Do you need help?" Mark called out, his voice sounding thin and foreign to his own ears. No response came from the figure. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Mark reached for his phone to call emergency services, cursing when he saw he had no signal. When he looked up again, the woman had vanished from his rearview mirror. Mark's breath caught as knuckles rapped against his driver's side window. She stood inches away, her face pressed against the glass, hair parting to reveal gray, mottled skin pulled tight over sharp cheekbones. Her eyes reflected the dashboard lights as glowing crimson pinpricks, like an animal's caught in headlights. But what froze Mark's blood was her mouth, stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing blackened gums and jagged, needle-like teeth. In pure panic, Mark slammed the car into drive and floored the accelerator. The tires spun on the gravel shoulder before catching asphalt. As the car fishtailed back onto the highway, Mark caught a final glimpse in his side mirror, not of a woman, but of a tall, emaciated figure dropping to all fours, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it scuttled after his car with terrifying, inhuman speed, covering ground faster than any person could run. 300 feet into the dive, Carlos's light beam swept across an unexpected vertical shaft. His training told him to mark the location and turn back. Solo divers should never attempt vertical navigation in unmapped cave systems. But his oxygen levels were good, and his curiosity overwhelming. He clipped a directional marker to his guideline and began a controlled descent. The narrow chimney opened suddenly into a cathedral-like chamber with an air pocket at the top. Carlos surfaced cautiously, keeping his regulator in his mouth until he tested the air with specialized equipment. Finding it breathable, he removed his mouthpiece and gasped. The chamber soared at least 60 feet overhead, its ceiling adorned with massive stalactites that caught the beam of his primary light. The acoustics were extraordinary, each water droplet creating echoes that seemed to whisper his name. Carlos switched to his helmet camera to document the discovery. As he panned across the ancient rock formations, his light caught something incongruous on a natural stone shelf. What appeared to be claw marks, 3 parallel grooves scored deep into the rock face. Beside them, barely visible beneath centuries of mineral deposits, were symbols that resembled Mayan glyphs, but unlike any Carlos had seen in his archaeological research. He moved closer, running his gloved fingers over the markings. They seemed to depict a warning, stick figures prostrating themselves before a looming shape with too many limbs. Below the crude pictogram was a more sophisticated carving, concentric circles surrounding what appeared to be a doorway. Carlos checked his dive computer. He had enough air for another 40 minutes of exploration. A narrow underwater tunnel descended from the chamber, heading deeper into the depth. Every safety protocol screamed at him to turn back, to return with the team. Instead, Carlos adjusted his buoyancy compensator and descended into the unexplored passage, unspooling his guideline behind him like Theseus entering the labyrinth. The tunnel narrowed until Carlos had to remove his tanks and push them ahead of him through the tightest sections. The crystal-clear water grew increasingly cloudy with disturbed silt, reducing visibility to arm's length. In cave diving, this was the point of no return, the moment when any responsible diver would retreat, knowing that the journey out would be through water too murky to see one's own hands. Carlos knew this, had taught this rule to dozens of students, had attended the funerals of those who ignored it. Yet he pressed on, driven by something beyond rational thought. The passage suddenly widened again, the sediment thinning enough for his light to reveal a perfectly circular chamber ahead. As he entered the space, his beam caught something impossible, a stone structure rising from the cave floor, clearly man-made. A rectangular doorframe stood independently, unconnected to any wall, its surface covered in carvings more sophisticated than those in the upper chamber. Carlos's archaeological training told him this was a significant find. This area had been underwater for at least 8,000 years, long before the Mayan civilization had developed such stonework. He approached slowly, careful not to stir up more silt. His camera light illuminated glyphs that seemed to undulate as he watched, an optical illusion caused by the water's movement and mineral deposits catching the light. Carlos reached out to touch the stone, noticing how unnaturally cold it felt even through his gloves. As his fingers traced a central glyph, resembling an octopus or squid, he felt the stone shift slightly under his touch. A cloud of ancient silt billowed up, momentarily blinding him. When it cleared, Carlos found himself staring at a dark opening where solid stone had been moments before. A doorway now stood open where there had been only a carved representation seconds earlier. From within came a soft, blue-green luminescence that seemed to pulse with a rhythm uncomfortably similar to a heartbeat. Carlos hovered at the threshold, transfixed by the ethereal light emanating from the impossible doorway. All scientific explanations failed him. Bioluminescent organisms couldn't survive this deep without sunlight or nutrients. and no geologic process could account for the rhythmic pulsing. His dive computer showed he had 23 minutes of air remaining at this depth, enough to record this phenomenon and retreat safely if he left immediately. He switched his helmet camera to video mode and edged forward. As he crossed the threshold, his primary light flickered and died. The backup unit on his hand activated automatically but stuttered erratically, casting wild shadows through the chamber. In the strobing light, Carlos glimpsed something moving within, a pale, elongated form with too many joints, unfolding from a recessed alcove. His backup light gave one final pulse before plunging him into darkness broken only by the pulsing bioluminescence, now revealing portions of what was emerging. A limb here, a segment there, never a complete view. Carlos fumbled for his third light, fingers numb with terror rather than cold. Something brushed against his calf, then wrapped around his ankle with the strength of steel cable, but the texture of wet silk. His emergency light finally ignited, revealing nothing attached to his leg, yet the pressure remained, beginning to pull him deeper into the structure. Carlos tried to reach for his dive knife, but his arms suddenly felt impossibly heavy, movement becoming sluggish as though the water had transformed to syrup. A sound penetrated his consciousness, not through his ears, but directly into his mind, a rapid chittering overlaid with something like speech, words in a language so ancient it predated language itself. Yet somehow he understood their meaning. "We have waited so long for another to open the way." His mask filled with a rush of black liquid that wasn't water, pouring from the regulator he no longer remembered placing in his mouth. As unconsciousness approached, Carlos's final coherent thought was the devastating realization that he hadn't discovered this place at all. It had summoned him here, just as it had called to those Mayan explorers thousands of years earlier whose warnings he'd failed to understand. The maintenance man she hired to seal the opening seemed unusually uncomfortable during the job. "Old houses have all sorts of nooks and crannies," he explained without meeting her eyes. "Best to leave them be sometimes." When Sarah pressed him about who might have used the space, he shrugged. Previous owner probably didn't even know it was there. Could have been from Prohibition days. Could have been something else. Lots of these old places have servant passages that got walled up over time. That night, Sarah dreamed of narrow corridors hidden within her walls, of someone watching her through imperceptible gaps in the plaster. She woke suddenly at 3 a.m., certain she'd heard scratching inside the freshly sealed wall. The maintenance man's casual warning echoed in her mind. Sometimes sealing up old spaces disturbs things that have been living there a long time. Might hear some noises for a few days until they find another way out, or in. On a rain-soaked Tuesday night in November, Sarah jolted awake at precisely 3:17 a.m. The digital clock's blood-red numbers cast an eerie glow as she lay frozen beneath her duvet, listening. The usual nighttime soundtrack of her home had changed. There was now breathing, soft and measured, with a slight wheeze on the exhale that wasn't her own. Sarah felt the hairs on her arms rise as she caught the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne. She kept her eyes locked on the darkest corner of her bedroom, where the breathing seemed to originate, too terrified to reach for the lamp just inches from her hand. Minutes stretched like hours until the sound gradually retreated, followed by the unmistakable creak of the third step from the top of the staircase, the one that always betrayed her own weight. Morning light dissolved Sarah's terror into something more manageable, perhaps a waking dream or sleep paralysis. She shuffled downstairs, desperate for coffee, when her bare foot landed in something wet on the kitchen tile. A puddle, as if someone had stood there dripping rainwater. Her favorite mug, the blue one with the chipped handle, sat on the counter still warm, a tea bag steeping inside. Sarah didn't drink tea. She never had. Heart hammering, she grabbed her phone to call the police when she noticed her camera roll was open. 3 new photos had been taken at 3:24 a.m. The first showing her own sleeping form from the doorway, hair splayed across the pillow. The second captured her face in close-up, a stranger's shadow falling across her parted lips. The third was a selfie of a man she'd never seen before, smiling beside her bed while she slept. Sarah moved in with a friend that day. She returned only once, accompanied by 2 police officers and a security specialist who installed cameras throughout the house. For 3 nights, nothing unusual appeared on the footage. On the 4th night, while reviewing the backyard camera feed, Sarah's blood turned to ice. A tall figure in dark clothing stood perfectly still beneath her bedroom window, neck craned upward at an uncomfortable angle watching. The timestamp showed he had remained in that exact position, barely moving, for 4 hours and 17 minutes. As Sarah zoomed in on his face, her phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "You look beautiful when you sleep, but even prettier when you're afraid. I've missed you these past few nights. I'm getting hungry again." The police investigation uncovered a sophisticated hideaway in the narrow space between Sarah's bedroom wall and the chimney shaft. Someone had carefully enlarged a maintenance hatch in the attic, creating a crawlspace living area with soundproofing materials stolen from a nearby construction site. Inside, they found a sleeping bag, bottles of water, protein bars, a bucket toilet, and most disturbingly, a shrine-like collection of items: hair from Sarah's brush, a toothbrush, unwashed clothes from her hamper, and dozens of photographs documenting her daily routine. Some photos dated back months before she had even purchased the house, showing her at grocery stores, at work, or jogging in her old neighborhood 10 miles away. The journal they recovered contained detailed notes on her sleep patterns, food preferences, and conversations, including phone calls he could only have heard by installing listening devices. The final entry, dated the morning after Sarah had fled, read simply, "She's gone looking for somewhere safe, but I've already found it. Waiting for her to settle in before I introduce myself again." Despite an extensive manhunt, the intruder was never identified or captured. Sarah moved to another state, but still wakes each night at 3:17 a.m., certain someone is watching her breathe. The search team found Carlos's body 3 days later, still tethered to his guideline 200 feet into the cave system. His tanks contained adequate air, and his equipment showed no malfunctions that could explain his death. What baffled the recovery divers was the location. Carlos was discovered in a small, unremarkable side passage, not in any significant chamber as his logged coordinates had indicated. There was no sign of the cathedral room with the air pocket, no vertical shaft, no carved doorway, just the typical limestone tunnels common to the Yucatan cenotes. More disturbing were the physical anomalies the medical examiner couldn't explain. Carlos's eyes had turned a cloudy white, as though cataracts had developed in hours. His body displayed no signs of drowning, but was drained of nearly 40% of its blood with no evident wounds or exit points. And his right ankle bore an unusual mark, a perfect ring of black symbols that resembled no known language, but which couldn't be removed even when the skin was scrubbed with alcohol. The most unsettling evidence came from Carlos's recovered equipment. His helmet camera's memory card contained corrupted files that tech specialists were able to partially recover. The footage showed the initial dive, the discovery of the vertical shaft, and the air-filled chamber exactly as Carlos would have described. The claw marks and symbols were clearly visible in several frames. Then the video degraded significantly, showing only strobing images of the circular chamber and stone doorway, before cutting to complete darkness. The audio, however, remained intact, capturing Carlos's increasingly panicked breathing, followed by a strange chittering sound that audio analysts compared to hundreds of insect mandibles clicking simultaneously. The final 30 seconds contained Carlos's blood-curdling scream, followed by a gurgling silence and a single phrase spoken in what linguists identified as Proto-Mayan. "The doorway remains open." Local authorities sealed the passage to that section of the cenote with concrete, citing structural instability and dangerous conditions. 6 months later, 3 separate dive teams reported hearing rhythmic tapping sounds from behind the concrete seal, as if something was attempting to communicate in Morse code. Analysis of the pattern revealed the same message repeated continuously: "Send amor." The Mexican government has since prohibited all diving in the area, erecting a steel barrier around the cenote with warning signs citing toxic water conditions. Satellite imagery, however, shows a steady stream of vehicles arriving at night when the site should be deserted, bearing government markings. Local residents report hearing drilling equipment and generators running throughout the night. along with strange lights emanating from the water, a pulsing blue-green glow that can't be seen from nearly a mile away. Mark drove non-stop until dawn broke over the mountains, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, too terrified to pull over even when his gas light began blinking urgently. He finally stopped at a small-town diner where 3 semi-trucks in the parking lot promised safety in numbers. His hands shook so badly he spilled coffee down his shirt as he described his encounter to the waitress. She called over an elderly indigenous man from the counter who listened without interruption, his weathered face growing increasingly grave. "You drove Highway 16? The old man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We call it the Highway of Tears. Dozens of women have vanished along that stretch since the 1970s. When Mark described what he'd seen, the old man nodded solemnly. "That wasn't a woman, son. The Wendigo takes forms that make us stop, make us want to help. It feeds on those who pull over. You're alive because you drove away." 3 weeks later, back in his Seattle apartment, Mark received a small package with no return address. Inside was a button, the same distinctive brass button from the suit jacket he'd been wearing that night. Attached was a handwritten note. "You dropped this when you drove away. I've been keeping it warm for you. See you soon." The postmark was from a town 30 miles from his apartment, not from British Columbia. That night, Mark heard tapping on his bedroom window, 17 stories above street level. Elena Vasquez's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, racing to finish her psychology paper before her Monday night babysitting shift ended. The Whittaker home hummed with the comforting sounds of an empty house, the dishwasher's gentle cycle, the occasional ice maker drop, the heating system's contented sighs. She'd been watching the Whittaker twins, 8-year-old Jack and Emma, every Monday for over a year while Dr. and Mrs. Whittaker attended their standing dinner with hospital colleagues. Elena knew this house as well as her own. Which floorboards creaked, all of them in the upstairs hallway, which windows stuck, the one in the guest bathroom, and which light switches controlled which fixtures. The confusing 3-panel array in the kitchen that Dr. Whittaker himself couldn't figure out. The twins had been unusually subdued tonight, barely touching their mac and cheese dinner before asking to watch a movie. They had fallen asleep on the couch before the halfway point, and Elena had carried them up to bed one at a time, their warm weight against her shoulder a reminder of when they'd been smaller. Now, as the clock ticked toward the parents' 11 p.m. return, Elena settled deeper into the plush living room sofa, enjoying the rare quiet and the generous hourly rate that helped pay her college tuition.